Hey, welcome to another episode of GeekOutdoors.com. So the Matrix Resurrections. Wow, 20 plus years later, we finally have a sequel to the trilogy of the Matrix movie. And the Matrix #1 is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's always going to be in my top list. And the sequels #2 and #3, even though they can't even hold a candle to the original, I still found them enjoyable, fun movies. So now we have the sequel. So how did it turn out? Well, let's just say anything that you expected out of this, you'll probably get that, but at the same time, there's also unexpected things as well. And so the general story is we come back and we meet Mr. Anderson again. But this time, he's not quite the same Neo Mr. Anderson that we remember. And at the same time, we also have some returning characters like Morpheus, but they're also not quite the same person. And then we have some other people who are very reminiscent of characters that you've seen before. And we have other returning characters, including villains. And of course, we have Trinity, played by Carrie Moss. And once we get back into the Matrix, you kind of find out that this movie is very meta. You'll probably hear that a lot. So it's very self-referential. And so just in general, kind of spoilerish, but not. But this Mr. Anderson is actually a very famous developer of a game called The Matrix. And it's actually a series of very popular games as well. And so in this case, you're in a Matrix movie talking about The Matrix. And then there's also the whole human and machines. We still have that story, but things are a little bit different now. So it is a sequel to the previous movies, although it's not a direct sequel like you would think, meaning that most of the movie isn't coming after all the events of what happened before. It spends a lot of time in this pseudo Matrix world, but you do get a sequel to the trilogy. So I do want to say that. And then it's kind of like, in general, just like the story about Neo and Trinity. As with all the other Matrix movies, even though we have a lot of things that are covered there, it's mainly about those two, and it's still the same here. And so that's kind of like the overall general story without giving too many things away. Now, getting to the things that I did enjoy about the film are definitely Keanu Reeves and Carrie Moss. At least for me, Keanu Reeves is always going to be known as Neo and Carrie Moss as Trinity. I think they are the perfect people for those roles, and that really cemented them in the whole acting lore. They're always going to be remembered as those two people, even though they've done many other things, especially Keanu Reeves. But at least for me, they're always going to be known as those two characters, and they were definitely the best thing about this movie. And I would say the best thing about the other Matrix movies as well. It's just those two actors embody these characters perfectly. Now, unfortunately, people like Lawrence Fishburne, Hugo even, didn't come back, and it is explained to why they're not there in a way. But at the same time, as you see in this review for this particular movie, maybe it was good that they didn't come back for it. So definitely Keanu Reeves, Carrie Moss, the best thing. And then the second thing that I did enjoy about the movie is if you are a fan of The Matrix, there is a lot of nostalgia, fan service, even many scenes that are almost shot for shot. And so the whole movie, it is very self-aware, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So if you are a Matrix fan, there's so many things here. Actually, the majority of the movies always references back to those previous movies. And so you'll see things like flashbacks, different scenes, as I mentioned, lines, action scenes. There is a lot of Matrix nostalgia here. And so if you are that type of person who loves that stuff, then you will enjoy this movie. For serious YouTubers, check out TubeBuddy, the premier tool news at GeekOutdoors.com. Get more done today by checking out the affiliate link in the description area below. And unfortunately, those are probably the two best things about the movie, because the rest of the movie, wow, this is where it was really hard for me, because whenever I saw the trailers, I was like, okay, there are certain things that I kind of see here that I'm expecting is going to happen. And in this movie, it does happen. Mainly that this movie relies a lot on nostalgia. And so a lot of it is rehash. Okay, a lot of the same scenes, action, lines, a lot of it's already been done before in those movies, and they do the same thing here. That was my worry whenever I saw the trailer, and unfortunately, that's what you have here. So most of this movie is really nostalgia based. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of original ideas. And so the whole story is really based upon the previous Matrix movies. So you have this whole self-referential and this whole meta thing, but at the same time, it kind of becomes a parody of itself. And that's something that I did not enjoy at all. And it's really hard to do that in a good way. But the thing is, this movie, most of it is that. And so that's probably the worst thing about the movie is it didn't really have its own, I would say, story, its own narrative, its own life outside of the previous Matrix movie, because it relies so heavily on those other ones. And whenever you see flashbacks, scenes from the other movies, in some ways I kind of get it, but at the same time, once you see it over and over, it kind of becomes lazy, you know. And it also makes me wish that I was watching those other movies, especially the original Matrix. And so that's the first thing that really disappointed me, is the overall story. It had things that I expected, and then the things that were unexpected was you do get a sequel to it. So there is its own story in a lot of ways, but it didn't really set itself apart from being in the shadow of the Matrix movies. And then the second thing that I just did not really like about this movie is just the fact that it was kind of all over the place, okay? So just kind of think of like all the three Matrix movies put into one here. And so it kind of goes back to the whole thing. This movie doesn't have its own identity. And then when you're watching it, you're like, okay, am I watching Matrix 1 with all its themes and concepts? Or am I watching Matrix 2, you know, whenever those things happen? Or am I watching Revolutions? And then it puts in a lot of characters that you kind of remember, but they're not the same, into this one movie. And so it tries to do a lot into one. So just kind of think of like, what would a Matrix movie be like if all three of them were in one? And that's kind of what you get here. And it's basically the greatest hits from the Matrix movies in the Matrix Resurrections. And so that's another thing that I didn't enjoy. And then the third thing that I did not enjoy about this movie is just that besides Neo and Trinity, the rest of the characters were just not interesting or memorable at all. Even the new Morpheus, you know, and I really don't put this on the actors and actresses themselves. It's just that they weren't interesting. They didn't really add any value. And even when it brought back older characters, it didn't really improve the movie at all. If anything, it made me wish that I was watching the previous movies, even part 2 and part 3. And so it's really hard for a movie to, you know, really elevate itself whenever most of the characters, like 90% of the characters in this movie, you don't really care about, you know. And that's kind of like the whole feeling I got watching this whole movie. And all I really cared about was just Neo and Trinity's story. And even that, you know, their story was pretty much the only thing that carried this movie from beginning to end. And then another thing that was really surprising to me is that the action was just not that good, to be honest with you. And overall, in this 2-hour plus movie, there's not that much action. And if I compared it to the original Matrix, or even Matrix 2 and 3, I would say the action and even the effects were more memorable, definitely from part 1, and better than it is in a movie in 2021. I know that sounds crazy, but whenever you watch it, you'll see what I mean. You know, even though the effects and the action were done well, done very competently, it just didn't really stand out and wow me or even impress me in any way. It was more like, oh, okay, here's another special effects movie in 2021. That's kind of like my whole thought. And action is, you know, nothing that was memorable at all, especially when you think about movies like John Wick that, you know, Keanu Reeves has been in. That was way better. So when it comes to action and even the special effects, it was just like good to mediocre in some cases. And then the final thing that I really found surprising is the fact that, well, I was bored. This movie was actually boring in the 2-hour plus runtime. There really weren't many parts of the movie that it was exciting, that it was interesting, that made me want to see more. And that is something I can't believe I'm saying, especially in a Matrix movie. And even when I compare it to Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions, even those movies I think were interesting and fun enough that I want to continue watching. In this case, it was neither interesting nor was it fun. And there was really no payoff at all. You know, once again, very nostalgic driven. And so if you watch any of these movies and then you watch this one, you see like, oh, I've seen that before, and it was done better than what it was here. And that's really the main thing, you know. It's just that if you're watching this expecting something different, something new, a continuation, an expansion of the world, you're not going to get this here. You're going to get more of the same but worse, you know. And this isn't even a reboot. It's more of a rehash. And it's really unfortunate because the whole world of the Matrix, the lore, the theories, everything else, and they actually reference this in this movie itself. There could have been so many things that could have been done with this. You know, I wanted to know more about the machines, you know, want to know more about Neo, Trinity, the people surrounding it. You know, why did this happen in the first place? How do things happen? There's just a lot of things in this movie that there was many opportunities and ideas that could definitely been expanded upon, or even going into different areas that they haven't done before. But unfortunately, Matrix Resurrection doesn't do it. And as far as I'm concerned, this is probably the worst in the Matrix series. And now that I think about it, honestly, they probably shouldn't have made this movie. I think the trilogy, you know, it was good enough. And just leave it at that, you know, because the Matrix one was revolutionary. The other two, it was good fun times. But the fourth one, it's like, yeah, probably not a good decision. And so those are my thoughts on The Matrix Resurrection. I really wanted to love and enjoy this movie because I love The Matrix 1 so much. And the other two, they were fun, enjoyable movies for me. But now that this has been released, it's really disappointing overall. And if you are a fan of the Matrix films, then I think you will get some enjoyment out of it. At least if you are a huge fan and you like nostalgia. But for everyone else, well, you might be bored. Let's just say that. So if you actually had any thoughts on this, be sure to leave that in the comments area below. And if you did want to see more of my sci-fi, film, or show reviews, I do have an entire playlist. I'll leave that in the description area below. So as always, if you did get value out of these videos, be sure to share, like, and subscribe. And if you're a creative geek like me, and you want to get exclusive access to more content that I don't put out here publicly on my YouTube channel, then join my Gold Content Creators Group, where you're going to get content like this and more for all the creative geeks out there. And the best part is, all of this is free. Simply head over to the link below, check out my page, and sign up for my Gold Content Creators Group.